Good afternoon, everyone. Depending on where you're joining us from, good morning or good evening. We had, I think, just under 1,000 registrants for this session. And we have over 500 of you already joining. So welcome. Thanks very much for the time and attention. And as always, a special thanks to our CFCS certified professionals as well as our members joining us today. I'm Brian Sabota-Kindle. I am the VP of Product Development with the Association of Certified Financial Crime Specialists. I'll tell you a little bit more about who we are in just a moment, but I want to thank you for the time and attention once again, and commend you for spending the time on this topic. This is modern slavery, know your supply chains, and very pleased to welcome back Colleen Dikdala and Katie Conroy as our presenters. So this time, if you joined us previously, they were dialed in. This time they're on video. So ta-da! You can see them today, and we're thrilled to have them back on this session. I want to commend you because this topic is one that is very relevant, very top of mind, but also important from a human rights perspective, and important from a simple, ethical perspective. In addition to being a potential reputational risk, financial crime issue, it's something that can help us all really just do the right thing when it comes to securing the supply chains and securing the financial system. To learn more about it, recognize indicators, recognize data that can help us prevent modern slavery within supply chains, or if we're not necessarily a company that has a supply chain per se, within our customers' supply chain. So again, thanks for being here and for paying attention to this issue. Just want to tell you a little bit about who we are in case this is your first time joining us. We're the Association of Certified Financial Crime Specialists, and we're pleased to bring you this presentation in partnership with RDC, who will be supplying the knowledge and expertise here today. We're a member association that exists to serve you, the community of financial crime professionals, whether you're in a role related to money laundering, fraud, tax evasion, sanctions, general operational risk, whatever the case may be, we're the big tent for financial crime professionals. We try to provide knowledge, resources, and training that touches on all those worlds and takes a holistic view toward financial crime risk. So we offer membership, which includes access to a whole host of informational and training benefits, including webinars, our webinar archive, news and analysis. We also administer the Certified Financial Crime Specialist, or CFCS credential. And we offer online training tools and virtual events, hopefully someday in the near future, knock wood. There will be live events potential as well. So please visit our website, acfcs.org, to learn more about everything we have to offer and get involved with us today if you're not already a member. You will find on the right-hand corner of your screen, kind of down here, and you may have to scroll over if you're not currently seeing it, a resource box. That resource box contains a link to the site, but it also contains a whole host of other resources provided by our presenters. And I definitely urge you to check that out. There's some really good material there from the RDC Data Insights blog and a number of external sources. So that's very helpful. I think we'll refer to some of it during this presentation. It's available there, again, your resource box. If you're not seeing the resource box over there on the right, you may need to scroll over. This is a browser-based platform. If you have any issues with audio, visual, slides not advancing, try refreshing first. That usually takes care of most of it. If they persist, close out the browser, rejoin. If you're not currently using Firefox or Chrome, try switching between them. If you're on Chrome, try Firefox, vice versa. And finally, just a couple other notes on logistics. This session is being recorded. It will be posted to the site within 3 business days of the presentation. You will be able to access it if you're an ACFCS member, along with a copy of the slides. ACFCS members can also get their certificate of completion once that is posted and it will be posted to our learning portal. Log in on the homepage, and you'll be able to view the recording, slides, and certificate there. Please ask questions throughout this presentation. I see some of you have already asked questions. I'll take a look at those as soon as I'm done my spiel here. And please continue to ask questions. We'll save time at the end for dedicated Q&A. You can do that by typing your question into the Q&A box on the bottom left. Finally, fill out the survey at the end of this presentation. Let us know your thoughts and feedback. Let us know topics you'd like to see us cover in future presentations, because it definitely helps us guide the content. So with that, I'd like to briefly introduce Colleen and Katie once again. Colleen Dikdala is a data research analyst at RDC. She heads up the politically exposed persons research collection and quality assurance there. And as mentioned, I mentioned it before, I think I called it Data Insights, but now I think it's called Insider Insights, which she co-leads and is a really valuable tool for anyone who's in intelligence investigations or just generally curious about some of the financial crime trends and geopolitical events that they're highlighting there. She's joined by Katie Conroy, who is a data operations analyst at RDC. She also leads RDC's Insider Insights development, and is RDC's Name Matching Council chairwoman. She's also an advocate on their environmental, social governance, or ESG task force. And this is actually one of those key issues within that space. So very pleased to have both of you join us again. Thank you very much for being here, and please take it away from here. Colleen, you may be on mute right now. If it looks like you're talking, but I don't hear you.
There we go. How's that?
Excellent. Yeah, gotta play webinar bingo. So whoever had mute just can put a token on that one.
All right. Thank you, Brian. And hello, everyone who's joined us today. As Brian said, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us for this presentation. During the presentation, we will cover modern slavery, but more specifically, forced labor and the patterns and trends we see in global supply chains. We will also look at a case study on the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, China, and the reputational risks of being associated with these forced labor practices. And finally, we will cover how your organizations can address these risks within your current screening programs. Much of the data you will see presented today is derived from the 12.5 plus million risk profiles contained in RDC's Global Risk Information Database, or GRID. These are made up of adverse media, sanctions and watch lists, PEPs, and other special collections such as virtual currency or marijuana-related businesses. So what we do with Insider Insights is we take all of this data and we analyze it to identify patterns and trends within the world of financial crime.
Yeah, thanks, Colleen. And although our Insider Insights series is only about a year old, modern slavery is not a new topic for us. Some of our past insights include cross-border migrant smuggling and bride trafficking, which calls for better collaboration between international institutions. And another focus that we looked at was we had an interview with Dr. Nisi Hamilton, a survivor of sex trafficking. And from this piece, we learned how understanding survivors' stories is an essential component to identifying predicate and consequential crimes to human trafficking. So we'll touch on both of these topics a little bit throughout our presentation, but on this piece today, we're going to look at in-state government-sponsored human smuggling for the purposes of forced labor. And we're going to take the angle about tracing the supply chain of products fabricated by forced labor and its impact on your screening program. So let's go to our first poll question. All right. Brian, you want to take that away?
Sorry about that. I was on mute. We're trying to get everybody in here. Okay, so first question is pretty straightforward. Do you currently collect supply chain network information from clients? Our answer options are yes, no, or simply unsure. I'm interested to see what comes back here. I have my thoughts, but go ahead and select the radio button that best fits your answer, either yes, no, or unsure, and hit submit. You should be seeing this right there in your slide view window, right in the middle. And we'll let this run for just a few more seconds since it's pretty straightforward one. So 5 seconds, answer now, or hold your peace, and I'm going to advance. Let's see how we did. So it looks like just 14% are confident that they do collect supply chain network information from clients. 40% do not. And that's kind of what I figured. The majority, well, just under the plurality, I guess, 46% are just unsure whether they do or not. So anything surprise you there? Anything jump out at you?
Not necessarily surprising or something that jumps out, but before we go into why that might be an important step for some institutions on this call to take, I want to take a quick minute to go over the definitions of modern slavery and forced labor that we will be using in the presentation today. So, modern slavery, in the broadest terms, is the severe exploitation of other people for personal or commercial gain. While this does encompass forced labor, it also umbrellas many other high-risk crimes such as organ trafficking, human trafficking, sex slavery, child labor, and, as I said, many other high-risk crimes relating to that severe exploitation of people. And since we are discussing global supply chains, we're going to focus more closely on forced labor. So forced labor is defined as any work or service in which people are forced to do against their will under threat of punishment. According to the International Labor Organization, forced labor refers to situations in which persons are coerced to work through the use of violence or intimidation, or by more subtle means such as manipulated debt, retention of identity papers, or threats of denunciation to immigration authorities. The poll questions. All right. So forced labor is an estimated $150 billion industry. According to the International Labor Organization, as of 2016, there were 24.9 million people in forced labor, with the prevalence highest in Asia and the Pacific. A notable figure is out of that 24.9 million people subject to forced labor, an estimated 4.1 million people were subject to what's called state-sponsored forced labor, which we will touch on more in the Uyghur case study. But to give an introduction, state-sponsored forced labor is when individuals are required to work, recruited to work by the state in industries such as agriculture, construction, and even in military organizations. By analyzing RDC's adverse media captures, we actually found that reported modern slavery events related to forced labor have increased 92% from the period of 2017 to 2019. And even more pressing is that 2020 already exceeds the number of forced labor events that we captured in 2017 and is also looking to surpass the number of forced labor events in 2019, just proving that this industry is continuing to grow. And with that, we will go to our second poll question. Brian, if you could take that away.
Yeah, I'd love to. So the second question is, how often would a violation of modern slavery prevent a customer from being onboarded at your institution? Is it always? Is it frequently? Is it 50-50? Basically, half the time it would, half the time it would not. Infrequently, never, or unsure. Unsure was a popular answer last time around, so I imagine we might have similar results this time around, but let's see what kind of responses we get. So same as before, choose your answer and hit the submit button. If you're not seeing the submit button in your slide window, because there's a number of answers this time, you may have to scroll down. There should be a scroll bar on the right-hand side. So choose your answer or scroll down and choose your answer and hit the submit. And we'll let this run for just a few seconds. And While we do that, just throw a question out there actually from attendees, an attendee that just came in, pretty interesting. Do you think the increase in forced labor from 2019 to 2020 is a result of the COVID-19 pandemic at all? Is there anything to indicate that the pandemic has had an impact?
Not necessarily yet, Brian. What we've seen in the COVID-19 impact is that a lot of different crimes such as modern slavery and forced labor and these crimes that are known as hidden crimes, they stay hidden during times of lockdown and times of reporting on global pandemics and national issues. So what we expect to see is actually more convictions coming later down the line in either late 2020 or 2021 when the world opens back up, and then we will most likely see a jump in human trafficking, forced labor, modern slavery event type issues.
Got it. Thanks. All right. So choose now. And let's see what the results are. Oh, interesting. So 33%, 34% said a violation would always prevent a customer from being onboarded at your institution. Just because I saw a couple questions about this, I think, and Katie and Colleen, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the point of view of this question was from a financial institution onboarding a customer, and the customer was known or found to have violations of related to modern slavery in, either directly, I think in this case directly, because we have another question related to supply chain later. So for those that were wondering kind of what the question was trying to get at, I think that was the perspective. So, but in any case, about 34% said always, only about 5% said it never would, another 6% infrequently, and the most popular category, again, 41% unsure. So what do you make of that?
Well, this is really interesting to see, Brian. First of all, it's great to see that 33.6% of you would stop a customer from being onboarded with a modern slavery violation. And that also means that your organization will most likely be avoiding some of the financial regulatory actions and fines in the bodies that we will see on the next slide. So, modern slavery has been addressed in various regulations on both a national and an international level. Here you can see some of the key legislation that address modern slavery, but more specifically that addressed forced labor. First is the Tariff Act of 1930. This act raised tariffs on imports while also prohibiting any products created using forced labor, including child labor. The Modern Slavery Act of 2015, put into place by the United Kingdom, had the purpose and has the purpose of combating modern slavery and enforce transparency of forced labor practices in global supply chains. In 2016, the International Labor Organization's Forced Labor Protocol took effect, and this required ratifying states to take measures to prevent, protect, and remedy in their efforts to suppress forced labor, according to the provisions of the Forced Labor Convention. And that is the Forced Labor Convention that you see listed in the middle there. And not pictured is Australia's Modern Slavery Act, which came into force in 2018, going a bit deeper than the UK's Modern Slavery Act. And this actually required companies to report at a higher standard and address modern slavery risks in their annual reports, according to their anti-slavery policies. And then more recently and more prevalent to today's case study, we have seen the United States use the Global Magnitsky Act to sanction 3 PEPs from Xinjiang, China, the main location of the Uyghur population and training camps, which we will touch on shortly, and some other presidential orders blocking the imports of goods from that region with the knowledge that Uyghur forced labor was used to produce the blocked goods. So these regulations really prove that international cooperation is key in addressing modern slavery and is essential given its cross-border dimensions. And now I will pass it on to Katie to talk about some of the predicate crimes that you might not screen for specifically under these acts, but that are definitely related to modern slavery.
Thanks, Colleen. So when we talk about modern slavery screening scopes, we have to underscore the importance of predicate offenses. As Colleen mentioned before, modern slavery manifests in a lot of different ways, from forced labor to sex trafficking, to migrant smuggling as well. So those are some areas that we do tend to focus on in terms of modern slavery screening, in addition to sexual exploitation, kidnapping, as well as just organized crime in general. But even though Colleen talked about some of these international regulations, we must consider that legislations against modern slavery vary between jurisdictions. In prosecution of modern slavery, offenders may be more plausible under a different type of legislation, depending on where you are. So all of these areas highlighted on this graphic are subject to being predicate offenses of modern slavery. For example, drug trafficking and tax evasion are two areas that we learned from working with Dr. Nisi Hamilton on her story as a survivor. And we've also found that counterfeit documents are a common area of prosecution when it comes to migrant smuggling or bride trafficking. Cybercrime, of course, can also be tied to child pornography or organization of a human trafficking ring. And we also find that especially when we talk about supply chain transparency of major companies, environmental crimes is a big area of concern. For example, we've seen cases in the Borneo forest where logging companies and systemic abuses of sexual exploitation of indigenous women and girls are very prevalent. And in response to these issues, we have seen that some financial institutions have pulled out of these scopes, for example, with the Borneo forest. And this is in recognizing how slavery and human rights abuses are intimately intertwined with the extraction of raw materials. And in the Uyghur case that we're going to discuss today, this is referring to the transformation of raw materials via manufacturing, which, of course, is a great foundation of China's economy. Now, when we talk about the Uyghur case study, we're definitely going to touch upon some of these predicate offenses of the entities that have been involved with Uyghur forced labor in the supply chain. But we can't discuss the situation of the Uyghurs without emphasizing the consequential crime. And in the case of the Uyghurs, this is now being considered a genocide by certain governments and international bodies. And this is due to the cultural erasure practices that are happening in training centers, as well as evidence from survivor stories of torture and forced sterilization. So this just goes to show how ignoring forced labor accusations can turn into a much larger risk waiting to be uncovered. And this is why we really don't want to be ignoring repeated abuses by major organizations, including those committed within their supply chains. So this will bring us to our next poll question. Brian, if you'll take it away.
I would, yes. So this question now focuses on a similar setup as before, but we're looking at the supply chain. So how often would a violation of modern slavery in a customer's supply chain block a customer transaction at your institution? So in other words, you have a customer, they're trying to send a wire or whatever the case may be, potentially maybe a loan, commercial loan situation. And there's reason to believe, maybe through negative news, maybe through something else, that there is issues around modern slavery in their supply chain. So would that always cause you to reject that relationship or step away from that transaction in some way? Frequently, 50-50, infrequently, never, or unsure. And again, if you need to scroll down to find the answer, go ahead and use the scroll bar to do so. And we do have some great questions coming in. Definitely urge you to continue to ask questions. We'll have time at the end for Q&A. So appreciate all the questions coming in. So go ahead and choose the answer now. And let's see how we did. Again, always is a popular answer, so that's great. I think we have some robust defenses here, which is fantastic. Unsure is the most popular answer, once again, at about 38%. Frequently coming in at third place, and then the rest have about a smattering of responses. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think given the amount of people who do collect data on supply chains, this is a really great statistic. I think that kind of correlates with what we saw as far as who is collecting that supply chain information. And this really brings us to our next point, which is that often what comes up with Colleen and I and working on modern slavery is that us alone, and also any of you out there, we can't end modern slavery and supply chains alone. You know, these are major organizations that are involved in this Uyghur supply chain, and not one of us is going to be able to do it alone. So we see it as ending modern slavery in the supply chain is going to require drastic changes in global business operations. It's going to require actualizing systemic change through pressure on multiple fronts. And we believe that cooperation is key to applying this pressure. And these statistics do provide a little confidence in that possibility. But one thing that makes this difficult with the Uyghur case study is that the forced labor is state-sponsored. So to break down what's going on a little bit, according to the Australia Strategic Policy Institute, the government of China and the province of Xinjiang have facilitated a state-sponsored labor transfer scheme that is tainting the global supply chain with forced labor. Under the guise of supposed vocational education and training camps, there has been a mass transfer of over 1 million Uyghur, Kazakh, and other Turkic Muslim minority citizens from Xinjiang to factories across the country of China. Now, within these factories, people typically live in segregated dormitories. They undergo organized Mandarin and ideological training outside of working hours, and they're subject to constant surveillance. Additionally, they're forbidden from participating in any religious observances. Now, these facilities tied to the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corp, which is the government body responsible for these concentration camps, have been recorded purchasing military weapons and equipment intended to control or harm their victims of forced labor. As I spoke before a little bit on this idea of cooperation, we have seen that there's some global pressure on the situation coming under the Global Magnitsky Act. The US did sanction the autonomous region of Xinjiang's Communist Party Secretary Chen Chengguo and 3 other officials. But of course, we expect that PEPIN sanction screening is a mainstay of compliance. And in identifying the risks of forced labor in customer supply chains, this is going to require some additional layers of due diligence screening, especially in terms of adverse media on the various modern slavery screening scopes that I mentioned before. Now, as a result of rising awareness of Uyghur labor conditions in the media, company supply chains with operations in Xinjiang are coming under critical surveillance. So Colleen, could you discuss a little bit about what we've seen between connections with the manufacturing companies as well as these vocational and education training centers?
Of course, and thank you for that great overview, Katie. So what we found in the Australian Strategic Policy Institute report is that they highlighted a factory, the Hao Yimpong Factory or Manufacturing Clothing Company, or HYP, as I will refer to it going forward. They revealed that HYP had a relationship with a known Uyghur re-education camp called the Jiaixi Vocational School. Now, this school was reported to have sent dozens of Uyghur workers to HYP's new factory in Xinjiang. And then ASPI also highlighted and outlined how HYP was connected to many well-known apparel and footwear companies, both in their direct supply chain and indirectly in their supply chains. So I think this story and what Katie said before, they all go to show that in order to avoid this massive risk and the regulatory fines, you must both know your customers and you must know their supply chains.
Thanks, Colleen. And that ASPI resource that Colleen mentioned is in our resource section. So we do really encourage you all to take a look at that and see the supply chain that we're talking about in more detail. But looking at the surface layer of modern slavery screening and supply chains, I'm going to talk about 2 different risk identifiers. So the first one, of course, is geography. Geographic risk is always an expectation of compliance best practices. And in this case, it means using extra precaution when dealing with entities from Xinjiang and China at large. Now, as risky as this region may be, we know this is a common area for business transactions. The number of exports leaving Xinjiang province has increased 15-fold in the past 15 years. And this is in part as a result of a large workforce of free labor. And this is a sign of how forced labor has produced a substantial sector of not only China's economy, but of our global economic supply chain. Now, the second risk identifier that I want to discuss is the industries of suppliers or distributors. So according to the ASPI, Uyghurs are working in factories that are in the supply chains of at least 82 well-known global brands. And in terms of state-sponsored forced labor, Colleen mentioned that some of these industries were related to agriculture, construction, and military efforts. But this chart on the right shows some of the specific industries relative to Xinjiang's supply chain footprint. So we see that mechanical, electrical products, and high-tech products, as well as car parts, make up over 32% of the exports coming from Xinjiang. And some of the companies in the supply chain related to these areas might be Apple or BMW or Samsung or Sony, all ones that everyone's very familiar with. We also see that agricultural products, these make up about 6% of the exports. Two major agricultural products in Xinjiang are tomatoes and cotton. So these areas are related to other local industries, which include ketchup and tomato sauce, which is a little bit more than 2% of the exports. And then, of course, a major industry coming from Xinjiang are the clothing and accessories, footwear and textile and fabric industries, which are making up over 40%. So some companies that we've seen related to that might be Gap or H&M or Victoria's Secret. And just to put into context what this means as far as our global economic supply chain, roughly 1 in 5 cotton garments sold globally contain cotton and or yarn from the Uyghur region. So probably every single one of us has something that's been made in this region. Now, when we get to a little bit of a deeper layer of modern slavery supply chain screening, we want to look at specific factories, suppliers, specific distributors and services related to this area. But one part of the supply chain that's often overlooked are the auditors. So companies that are conducting supply chain screening cannot forget that auditors are an imperative key to their supply chain. You know, they're who's auditing each of these companies for forced labor infractions. So if they themselves have an infraction, that's something that we need to know. And companies in Xinjiang specifically are likely to receive no or limited levels of auditing. The provincial government has actually made the atmosphere of auditing so difficult to the point that 5 companies have told the Wall Street Journal they won't be providing auditing services in Xinjiang due to the challenges of detecting forced labor there. Now, one question then is, prior to these companies stating that they would not work in the region, would a supply chain screening program that included auditor screening have resulted in an alert on these companies? The answer is yes. Italian auditing firm RINA, or RINA, is one of the companies that told the Wall Street Journal that they wouldn't be conducting auditing in Xinjiang. Meanwhile, in 2012, we saw that they certified the safety of a textile factory in Pakistan according to International Labor Organization standards just 3 weeks prior to a factory fire that killed 250 people. So, of course, auditors who are facing such prior labor-related infractions are unlikely to risk auditing in such a difficult area. But this also underscores how screening auditors for adverse media can prove extremely valuable to really understanding your risk. For example, Coca-Cola responded to accusations of Uyghur forced labor in the supply chain at their sugar supplier COFCO, saying that COFCO conducted an internal audit covering issues of forced labor. However, if COFCO was screened as part of supply chain transparency, alerts would have shown that there were former forced labor violations related to COFCO in the past. This is shown in this article on the right from Globo about slave-like conditions at a COFCO institution in Brazil, and this is from 2017. So this is one predicate offense that COFCO is related to, in addition to other risks on their part, such as PEP association, tax evasion, regulatory fines, and even bribery. Now, so far we've discussed the risk scopes related to supply chain transparency, but how do we conduct an effective and responsible human rights due diligence screening program, or HRDD? So much of current company HRDD frameworks are based on weak assertions that endorse the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. And these charts here show just how such statements are crafted to protect investor value rather than victims of forced labor. So these two companies were accused to some degree of forced labor in the supply chain. On the left, you have the company Boohoo. They did not make a statement endorsing UN principles in their supply chain, and their stocks tanked post an accusation of labor abuse and potential slavery in their supply chain. Now on the right, you have the company H&M. They've made statements that endorse the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. They're even regarded as a leader in human rights due diligence. But in addition to the forced labor accusations presented here that were in 2018, they've also been accused of employing Uyghur forced labor in their supply chain, according to ASPI, and they've had no impact on their stocks. So that just goes to show how sometimes these HRDD frameworks can be a little bit empty in substance. Now, in terms of screening for human rights due diligence, there are a lot of different HRDD rating systems. And rating systems are great because they provide a foundation for us to base our due diligence on and our compliance with human rights. But at the same time, their ambiguities offer an incomplete picture to supporting a transparent HRDD program. So that's why adverse media screening is an essential element of responsible HRDD. In fact, Adidas is one example of a company that has worked to meet the criteria of HRDD rating frameworks without establishing a supply chain culture based on human rights transparency. So the Clean Clothes Campaign, Fashion Checker Tool, which is one of these rating systems, gave Adidas a 10 out of 10 for their supply chain transparency. But this is a misleading rating because adverse media and ASPI research has proven that the Adidas supply chain has been associated with Uyghur forced labor. So this again underscores the need for adverse media screening as part of a responsible and effective HRDD framework. Now, with these considerations in mind, Colleen is going to discuss what actions financial institutions can take right now to end modern slavery in the global supply chain. So off to you, Colleen.
All right, thank you, Katie. Screening is an imperative, very important mechanism for financial institutions to have in place to stop these labor organizations from exploiting human labor and to stop modern slavery in the global supply chain. A couple key procedures and policies organizations should have in place to do this are as follows. Organizations need to keep an up-to-date compliance structure. So this means keeping clear anti-slavery policies in place and making sure that all employees and customers alike are aware of this policy. This also includes knowing where your clients do business, especially if it's in a higher risk jurisdiction. Now knowing about the high rates of forced labor in Xinjiang, China, and other geographically close provinces, you may want to reassess your risk tolerances in that area, as well as increase monitoring of any entities that you do business with in that area. Furthermore, it's not only knowing where your clients do business, it's knowing what industries your clients do business in. So as Katie touched on, different industries are actually at higher risk for being involved in forced labor practices somewhere in their supply chain, such as the automotive, apparel, and mechanical and electrical products. So it's very important to know whether your clients are working on a large or small scale level within these industries. Even further, it's important to know if your client's supply chain is transparent and adheres to your anti-slavery policies that you have in place. So this goes into managing your international relationships as well. It will benefit your organization in the long run to require anti-slavery covenants in contracts. This will help clear up that transparency issue in your client's supply chain, which allows you to not only know your customers, but know your customers' suppliers. As we've seen, this is imperative as forced labor trickles into the supply chain, especially when we see it happening lower down or indirectly on the distribution list, such as in the case of some of the companies with the Haoyam Hong Manufacturing Clothing Company. And then it is also important to incorporate a strong audit program into your compliance structure. This flows into knowing who your customer does business with. So when you're doing business with a corporate or an organization, a piece of their supply chain that you need to be concerned about when you are looking to onboard them is their auditor. As we've seen, it's not just about following the ratings or doing a quick Google search for negative news. Incorporating these types of programs will give you the justifications needed to speak to a regulator about your client's supply chains. And lastly, make sure everyone at your organization is trained to watch for red flags, specifically surrounding forced labor and modern slavery. This can include child labor, inhumane working hours, physical abuse or captivity, workers unable to leave, controlled mobility of workers, withheld documents and visas. And as we saw in the beginning, the threat to immigration authorities is also a large red flag. So finally, we're going to leave you with some key takeaways from today's presentation. Modern slavery screening requires supply chain screening. If this presentation has shown anything, it's that forced labor and modern slavery can trickle into supply chains in indirect and direct ways, and it's important for your reputational risk, as well as that you're following regulatory guidelines for your organization to screen against modern slavery. Adverse media is essential to screening for forced labor in supply chains. Adverse media has shown some auditors acting poorly before auditing certain areas or companies. So we definitely want to pay attention to screening for adverse media, as this will also show predicate crimes. And then preventing modern slavery and its associated illicit funds from entering the financial system requires looking beyond basic human rights due diligence measures. So as Katie touched on with the different HRDD measures, it is important to incorporate those kinds of due diligence measures in your company's compliance structures. So with that, I thank you for everyone for listening, and we will now open the floor for some questions.
Excellent. Thanks to you both. A really excellent presentation and eye-opening in a lot of ways for me, and I think for a lot of our attendees as well. So, we've gotten a number of questions around basically how would I know that a company has been implicated in modern slavery in some way, either at onboarding or in periodic review. And it sounds like adverse media screening, negative news screening is really a key element to that equation. But a number of our attendees seem like, they're wondering, are there sort of lists out there? Are there organizations that provide, hey, here's the like an OFAC screening list, right? Here's the modern slavery screening list. There's a really just kind of a layered approach that involves, your own due diligence, adverse media, so on and so forth.
So I do think it is. I do think it is that layered approach, as you said, Brian. It does, especially, as you said, include screening for adverse media. That is where you will find a majority of this information. One, list, if you want to call it, for example, or report. The ASPI report gives a very good picture of what forced labor is, and also goes into this case study a little bit deeper. But a lot of the different anti-trafficking or anti-human trafficking, anti-modern slavery, a lot of those NGOs and nonprofits will put out reports of how to watch for this and different industries or companies that are higher risk. Katie, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I think everything you said, Colleen, I do agree with, especially looking at different types of reports. I'm thinking about if you identify other areas that are prone to forced labor or other areas where you see trends in modern slavery, maybe then looking for reports on forced labor in those areas or other types of human trafficking. But yeah, I think the best way is probably through these reports that show these networks, and also through your own supply chain network data collection.
Got it. Thank you for that. Another question, a couple of questions around this were around, these customers from a financial institution perspective, some of these customers, retailers, merchants, that type of thing, would not necessarily be considered high risk for onboarding, they might not be subject to some of the enhanced due diligence that a more traditionally high-risk customer would be. I guess the question is, should you consider certain industries higher risk based on things like the type of industry they are and their susceptibility to modern slavery? Do you see companies, particularly financial institutions, incorporating that into their risk assessment? So, when assessing risk, is there, are you seeing increasing adoption of modern slavery as one of the risks they're assessing for?
I think we have seen in recent history that there is a higher level of concern around modern slavery. I know that in Australia, there have been certain directives that have made modern slavery screening more important. And I imagine that's something we'll see an increase on in the upcoming years. Colleen, do you have anything you want to add on that?
Oh, I think that's a really good point. I think that, as modern slavery continues to take over different headlines and news titles and everything, it really, continues to grow. And we've seen that this need for financial institutions to screen for these individuals is very important.
Yeah, and I think another point in considering the level of risk is also when we look at, say, this Uyghur case and the ASPI report, these are all major global companies. It's no one who's just a small retailer. So I think also the size of the organization and that global reach in our supply chain is another important element to consider.
It makes total sense that there would be differing levels of risk depending on the global reach of the supply chain. Question related in particular to the Asian region. Which country or specific region is highest risk, is most commonly coming up with issues related to modern slavery? You highlighted this example within China. Are there other regions that are also considered high risk?
Yeah, yes. We've definitely... Sorry, go ahead.
You take it.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that Pakistan is a region where, especially in 2019, we saw there was a big trend of Pakistani families sending their daughters to China, and it ended up being a bride trafficking ring. So Pakistan's a country that we do see a lot of different types of modern slavery cases. And I believe also there was a case last year from Vietnam to the UK, which was a forced labor migrant smuggling case. So those are a couple of the countries we've seen some cases in. I don't know, Colleen, if there's anything you want to add to that.
Just one other, with India, we also see high rates of human trafficking and modern slavery, actually a lot specific to organ trafficking and specifically human trafficking rackets. So a lot of organized crime related to human trafficking and modern slavery in India.
Great. Thank you for that. Question on U.S. laws. You mentioned the Tariff Act of 1930. Is there anything more recent, either under consideration or current, related to modern slavery and imposing regulatory or compliance obligations on financial institutions that you know of?
So not off the top of my head that I know of. I do know that the United States does subscribe to all of the protocols and procedures that the International Labor Organization does put in place. There have been different trade legislations and sanctions and orders over the years that have addressed modern slavery sort of as a one-off situation. But I can definitely look up some either legislations in the works or if there's anything that's recently been released in the United States and get back to you with that question or that answer.
Good. Thank you for that. And follow-up question related to the U.S. Do you have any data or any comments on how prevalent modern slavery is within the United States? Obviously, this isn't just an issue that occurs in other countries. There are people who are trafficked here, forced labor, that type of thing. So any comments on U.S.-based slavery or forced labor?
Certainly. And at least in terms of reporting, the US is one of the highest countries that we see reporting of human trafficking cases. One area specifically that we focused on before was Texas. I think, Colleen, correct me if I'm wrong, Texas was the #1 state in the United States for human trafficking cases. But even within Texas, we see that there's different topologies of modern slavery. So, for example, in Laredo, which is right on the border between Mexico and the US, we might see more cases of migrant smuggling. But in Houston, Texas, we see that there are really high rates of sex trafficking. And that's actually something we dive a little deeper into in our piece with Nisi Hamilton. I also know Ohio is a state that has pretty high rates. Some others are escaping me. Colleen, I'm not sure if you have any other comments on within the US.
Yeah, I mean, it's very common, as I'm sure a lot of people on this call know, that this modern slavery, it happens everywhere. And a lot of it is condensed in cities. So we did see a lot of the larger cities. So Houston wasn't necessarily surprising to see a lot of human trafficking, but then there was a small town in Ohio in which there were some forced labor and cultural erasure practices that were happening that kind of stood out as an anomaly. And it's really those anomalies that we look at and say, oh, wow, this is a small rural town where a large human trafficking ring is operating. And, we can drill down into that and see those different areas. But Katie, like you said, Houston, other areas, New York City, Los Angeles, a couple other places in California. But it is a global crime. It happens everywhere, and it is very widespread in the U.S. as well.
And I would imagine that some of the difference is a matter of detection and reporting, right? So it's not a question of, it's not happening because there's no cases or no examples. It could just be simply unreported or, not detected by law enforcement, not a law enforcement priority. So I imagine it's a little bit difficult to track effectively for that reason. And there's some noise in the data, so to speak, as a result.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, and that's one of the caveats when we talk about human trafficking in cities versus in rural areas, is that rural areas are likely to have less reporting. There's also likely to be more of a community backing in a way. There are some cases where there's sort of like child marriage or bride trafficking cases where, a landlord is forcing a family to give over their daughter because they can't pay their rent. So, in some of those areas, you might see that's a little bit more internal within the community, and we're not getting those reports or seeing what's going on there.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. Question regarding types of activity, particularly types of industries or businesses that might be considered higher risk in one country versus another. Attendee is asking, are there certain types of businesses that in one country might be lower risk for various, cultural or historical reasons, and higher risk in others, right? So if you see a kind of classic in the United States, massage parlors, or spas, places labeled like that are often at considered a higher risk for human trafficking. If you go to Sweden or Finland, a spa or massage parlor looks very different than it might look in the United States, and conceivably is lower risk. Is that the case, that there are companies, industries that it's very cultural or very country specific, and how do you account for that when you're screening or building out a program?
Yeah, we haven't taken a super deep dive looking into that, but I'm so glad that question was asked because I was just building a hypothesis on this yesterday. So I think, like we see with this Uyghur case, we're seeing that these people are in manufacturing companies. And we know that that's a huge part of China's economy. Meanwhile, in places like the US, you think of like spas and massage parlors, and that's more of a service economy. So I think even just understanding sort of the basis of the economy you're looking at can help you identify where forced labor is going to be. And if I had to hypothesize, I would think it's most grounded in whatever industry or area that country is supporting the most, And like I said, too, with that Borneo forest case, that's looking at a logging environment, and that's a resource-cursed area, and you're seeing forced labor or sexual exploitation happening at that area within the logging industry. So I think just being aware of the political economies of each of these nations is an important part to evaluating where you're going to see forced labor show up.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. For example, I was recently reading some articles about Bangladesh, and garment manufacturing, textiles are a huge part of the Bangladesh economy, and that's where a lot of the cases I was reading about were taking place, was within the textile industry. So, question regarding kind of why this is so hard to get right. So you referenced, that auditing groups are not always getting it right. There was that one that signed off on a factory before it burned down and killed several people, and these other instances. So why is there such a struggle to identify modern slavery within supply chains? And I guess my follow-up question would be, is there anyone out there that you do see kind of doing a good job of it?
Yeah, so I'm not positive on any certain companies that are really, doing a great job of it right now. Katie, do you have any idea what you're thinking now? But in the context of the first question, I think that, it really depends on what those companies are doing and what their responses are to their anti-slavery policies in their main organization and then also in their supply chain. So this also goes to show that some companies may not know that what's going on in their supply chain. But I think one of the main points is it's knowing who your customer does business with, and it's knowing who's auditing your customer and where your customer is doing business. Really just getting all of that information that you can on your clients and customers will give you the clearest, most transparent picture of how to stop this and why it's so difficult. And I think one other reason has to do with what Katie touched on earlier, is that cross-border jurisdictions and the different regulations that do actually prosecute modern slavery and forced labor. So in some countries where it may be acceptable for these certain working conditions to occur, they might not have very strong reporting or regulations in that area for someone to actually, blow the whistle and say, hey, something really bad is happening here. Anything to add, Katie?
Yeah, unfortunately, the name of the company escapes me, but in the Wall Street Journal article about how those auditing companies weren't going to do work in Xinjiang, there was a piece about how sort of confidence in the auditing industry is deteriorating a bit. And so now we're seeing that companies are actually popping up that are auditing the auditors. So that's kind of an area I think we'll see growing a little bit more as this human rights due diligence becomes more imperative to different organizations.
That's interesting that there's a second layer of auditing popping up, but it makes sense given a response to what's been taking place. So we are just about at time. Let me just see if there's one more question. So one question is, related to the pandemic. A lot of the nature of financial transactions has changed. There's less use of cash, for example, which is a little bit harder to trace, more use of credit cards, ACH, wire payments. Do you think that the changing transaction patterns and potentially changing activity at financial institutions as a result will make some of this activity easier to detect? So in other words, some forced labor activity that may have been primarily cash-based, more underground economy, may be forced more into the mainstream financial system. Is there any indication that you've seen that that might be happening, or just kind of speculation on, you know, whether that might show up in the data in the future?
I have not seen that specifically happening yet. If anything, I think that financial institutions will, you know, learn in this ever-changing environment on how to deal with the risks that we had previously with organized crime, or sorry, not organized crime. Well, it can include it, but with modern slavery and human trafficking. But as Katie mentioned earlier, cybercrime is creeping into this modern slavery world even more as we are spending a lot more time online, and a lot of these transactions are transferring to the dark web and happening in virtual currencies. So this does lead back into why human trafficking and modern slavery are considered difficult, and, you know, why we really have to work together to combat.
Very much. Thank you. If up with you said again, is means already something will do.